Introduction. Pascal observed that the final decision an author makes is often what should be placed at the very beginning. Having gathered, written, and arranged these peculiar tales, the time has come to reflect on the nature of the work itself. There is a duality in the approach taken here, mirroring a duality within the observer, a simultaneous existence as both a naturalist and a physician. It is a perspective equally compelled by the scientific mechanics of disease and the romantic drama of the human condition. While animals may contract diseases, it is only humanity that truly falls into sickness, making the study of such conditions a window into the most fundamental questions of our nature. The patients encountered in these pages drive the inquiry. Constantly, the suffering individual forces the physician to question, and those questions lead back to the patient. It is a cycle that moves beyond the traditional medical study. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, established the concept of the case history, a chronological mapping of a disease from onset to resolution. This was a history of the pathology, a natural history of the ailment itself. However, such clinical accounts are often devoid of the person. They tell us nothing of the individual who struggles, survives, or succumbs. Modern case histories often reduce a human being to a mere phrase, a subject indistinguishable from a laboratory specimen. To truly place the suffering, fighting human subject back at the center of medical inquiry, we must deepen the clinical case into a narrative. Only by transforming the history into a tale do we recover the who alongside the what, restoring the patient's relation to their own illness and identity. This approach is vital in the realms of neurology and psychology, where the patient's very personhood is at stake. The study of diseases that affect the self cannot be separated from the study of identity. We are perhaps witnessing the birth of a new discipline, a neurology of identity, that seeks the neural underpinnings of the self, bridging the ancient chasm between mind and brain. While there may always be a categorical gulf between the physical brain and the psychic mind, stories that inhabit both realms can bring us closer to their intersection, where mechanism meets life. The great neurological tradition of the 19th century possessed a descriptive power that has largely faded in favor of impersonal science. It was A.R. Luria who called for a revival of this lost art, termed romantic science, which seeks to combine the analytical with the biographical. The histories presented here align with this tradition, harking back to Hippocrates and the universal human impulse to tell one's story. These narratives contain archetypal figures, heroes, victims, martyrs, but the travelers in these lands traverse realms that most of us can scarcely imagine. Their journeys are fabulous in the truest sense, requiring us to speak in fables as much as in facts. The book is structured to explore these strange territories. The first section concerns itself with deficits, the loss of neurological function. But a defect is never merely a loss. The organism always reacts, striving to preserve its identity through adaptation, however bizarre. Just as a physician must understand the disease, he must also understand this struggle for preservation. Following this, we explore the neglected realm of excesses. Neurology has ample vocabulary for what is lost, but lacks the language to describe the superabundance of function, the disorders of energy, impulse, and will that can define conditions like Tourette's syndrome. Here, the challenge is not a lack, but a surfeit of being. Beyond these lie the transports, manifestations of imagination, dream, and memory that alter perception and transport the individual to other worlds. These experiences, often dismissed as purely psychic, have organic roots that reveal the brain's power to generate entire landscapes of meaning. Finally, we turn to the world of the simple. In those labeled as retarded, we often find that while abstract thought is limited, the concrete powers of feeling, symbolism, and narrative are wonderfully preserved and even enhanced. Their world is not one of mere deficiency, but often of singular integrity and richness. These tales, then, are an attempt to navigate the borderlands of human experience. They are owed entirely to the trust and generosity of the patients who allowed their lives to be chronicled, in the hope that others might understand. They are also a tribute to mentors who understood that medicine is not just the study of an organism, but the care of a striving human subject. Neurology has a favored word, a word that echoes through its halls and textbooks like a mantra of negation: deficit. It is a term used to denote the impairment or absolute incapacity of neurological function, the loss of speech, of language, of memory, the loss of vision, of dexterity, of identity itself. For all these myriad breakages of the self, we have a vast lexicon of privative words, terms beginning with that denying a, aphonia, aphemia, aphasia, alexia, apraxia, agnosia, amnesia, ataxia. Each word stands as a tombstone for a specific neural or mental function of which a patient, through the ravages of disease or the cruelty of injury, has been dispossessed. The scientific mapping of this landscape of loss began in earnest in 1861, when Broca in France linked specific difficulties in the expression of speech, aphasia, to damage in a particular region of the left hemisphere of the brain. This discovery unlocked the gates to a cerebral neurology, a discipline that spent decades creating a cartography of the human brain, ascribing specific powers, linguistic, intellectual, perceptual, to equally specific centers of neural matter. Yet, as the century waned, it became evident to the more acute observers, to Freud above all, in his seminal work on aphasia, that this rigid mapping was too simplistic. Mental performances were not isolated islands, but possessed an intricate internal structure requiring a physiological basis of equal complexity. Freud sensed this particularly in disorders of recognition and perception, for which he coined the term agnosia. To truly understand such conditions, he believed, we would need a new, more sophisticated science. This new science of the brain and mind, which Freud could only envisage, was born amidst the turmoil of the Second World War in Russia. Founded by A.R. Luria and his colleagues, it was christened neuropsychology. Luria's life work developed this immensely fruitful field. Though its revolutionary import reached the West slowly, it was systematized in his monumental Higher Cortical Functions in Man, a work of profound analysis, and presented in a wholly different, almost novelistic light in his Pathography, The Man with a Shattered World. Yet, even within Luria's expansive vision, a vast realm remained untouched. His great works focused almost exclusively on the left hemisphere of the brain. Indeed, the entire history of neurology can be viewed as a history of the investigation of this one hemisphere. The right, or minor hemisphere, as it was dismissively called, was neglected. While the effects of lesions on the left were stark and easily demonstrated, the syndromes of the right hemisphere were elusive, indistinct. It was presumed to be primitive, a poor relation to the left, which was hailed as the unique evolutionary flower of the human brain. In a sense, this hierarchy is true. The left hemisphere is more sophisticated, more specialized, a later outgrowth of the primate brain. It is like a computer attached to the creature, designed for programs and schematics. But it is the right hemisphere that controls the crucial powers of recognizing reality, the powers every living creature needs to survive. Classical neurology, obsessed with schematics, found the syndromes of the right hemisphere, when they finally emerged, simply bizarre. Luria, in his later years, began to turn his gaze toward this neglected territory. In the working brain, he noted that these unstudied defects led to the most fundamental problems of consciousness and the role of the right hemisphere. He sensed that the study of this minor hemisphere would demand a new sort of neurology, a personalistic or romantic science, for here the physical foundations of the persona, the self, are laid bare. It is inherently difficult for patients with right hemisphere syndromes to know their own problems, a specific anosognosia that cloaks their deficit. It is equally difficult for the observer to imagine the inner state of such patients, for it is a state unimaginably remote from normal experience. Left hemisphere deficits are easier to conceive. We can imagine losing words. But how do we imagine losing the very structure of reality? Thus, it is not merely deficits in the traditional sense that engage us here, but neurological disorders affecting the self. Such disorders may arise from excesses as well as impairments, and these categories must be considered separately. However, it is vital to recognize that a disease is never merely a loss or an excess. There is always a reaction on the part of the affected organism, a striving to restore, to replace, to compensate, and to preserve its identity, no matter how strange the means. As Ivy Mackenzie powerfully stated, the physician is concerned not with a theoretical organism, but with a single, striving human subject fighting to preserve its identity in adverse circumstances. This dynamic struggle, recognized long ago in psychiatry, applies equally to neurology. Just as the delusions of paranoia can be seen as an attempt to reconstruct a world reduced to chaos, so too the pathological physiology of a neurological syndrome is a study in organized chaos. The organism, even in its damage, reorganizes itself on a new, albeit unstable, basis. In this first section, losses, we encounter the most profound challenges to the axioms of classical neurology. We find cases that defy the notion that brain damage simply reduces the individual to the concrete and emotional. In the case of Dr. P, the man who mistook his wife for a hat, we see the precise opposite. a man who has wholly lost the emotional, the concrete, the personal, and has been reduced to the abstract and the categorical. It is a condition of preposterous consequences, a reduction that renders the human subject into something akin to a computer. These tales, then, are studies of such organized chaoses, of individuals navigating the strange, uncharted waters of neurological loss, striving to maintain their being in a world that has fundamentally changed. Part 1, Chapter 1. Dr. P was a musician of significant distinction, a man whose life was entirely immersed in the world of song and performance. He had spent years as a renowned singer and later dedicated himself to teaching at a prestigious conservatory. It was here, amidst the students he had known for years, that the first peculiarities began to surface. It wasn't a loss of musical ability, his ear remained perfect, but a strange inability to recognize the faces of those around him. A student would approach, and Dr. P would not realize who it was until the student spoke. Conversely, he would occasionally offer a warm greeting to a fire hydrant or gently pat the top of a parking meter, mistaking them for the heads of children. These oddities were initially laughed off as the eccentricities of an artistic genius, a classic case of an absent-minded professor. However, the progression of these errors eventually became impossible to ignore. Diagnosed initially with diabetes, he consulted an ophthalmologist, assuming his vision was failing. The eye examination, however, revealed that his eyes were physically flawless. The problem was not in the seeing, but in the processing. The ophthalmologist concluded that the issue lay within the visual parts of the brain and referred him to a neurologist. Upon his arrival at the clinic, Dr. P presented as a man of great culture and charm. He spoke eloquently, his humor was intact, and functionally, he seemed entirely capable. Yet there was something unsettling about the way he made contact. He did not look at the listener, he looked around them. His eyes darted rapidly, fixating on a nose, an ear, a chin, treating the face not as a unified whole, but as a collection of isolated features. He constructed the person before him out of these fragments, rather than perceiving a complete identity. The examination proceeded with routine neurological tests, which Dr. P navigated with unusual strategies. When asked to remove his shoe, he did so, but when asked to put it back on, he gazed intently at his own foot, unable to recognize it as a part of his body. He paused, confused, until his hand touched the leather of the shoe, at which point tactile recognition kicked in instantly. To probe further, a glove was produced. When asked to identify the object by sight alone, Dr. P could not name it. Instead, he offered a complex geometric description, speaking of a continuous surface enfolded upon itself with 5 distinct outpouchings. He saw the geometry, the abstract topology of the object flawlessly, but he had absolutely no concept of its gloveness. It was only when he accidentally slipped his hand inside that he exclaimed, "My God, it's a glove!" The visit concluded with the most startling incident of all. Dr. P looked around for his hat to leave. He reached out his hand and firmly grasped the top of his wife's head, attempting to lift it and place it upon his own. He had, quite literally, mistaken his wife for a hat. His wife, seemingly accustomed to such surreal errors, simply removed his hand, and they departed with the dignity of a couple leaving a tea party, leaving the neurologist stunned. A home visit was arranged to observe Dr. P in his natural environment. The walls of his apartment were lined with paintings he had created over the years. They served as a chronological map of his neurological decline. The early works were realistic, filled with concrete details and feeling. As the years passed, the paintings became increasingly abstract, eventually dissolving into chaotic lines and nonsensical cubist forms. It was not an artistic evolution, but a pathological one. He was losing the ability to perceive the concrete world, leaving him with only abstract schemas. Further tests confirmed this profound agnosia. When shown a rose, Dr. P admired its symmetry but did not recognize it as a flower until he was allowed to smell it. When the television was turned on to a silent film, he could not follow the narrative. He saw only shifting shapes and isolated movements. He had lost the ability to synthesize visual information into a meaningful whole. Yet, despite this visual disintegration, Dr. P functioned. The secret lay in his music. He lived his entire life to a rhythm. He hummed while dressing, while eating, while bathing. As long as the score of his life played, he could act. If interrupted, if the music stopped, he would freeze, lost in a world of disconnected sensations, until the rhythm was re-established. The neurologist realized that traditional medicine had nothing to offer Dr. P. There was no pill to restore the synthesis of his visual world. However, his salvation lay in what remained perfectly preserved, his musicality. The prescription was not pharmaceutical, but existential. He was told to live entirely through music, to make his life a song, for it was only through the temporal structure of music that he could organize the chaos of his spatial perception. And indeed, until the end of his life, Dr. P continued to teach and live with dignity, his world held together by melody. Postscript. This case forces a confrontation with the limitations of classical neurology. Historically, the focus has been on the abstract functions of the left hemisphere: language, calculation, logic. Dr. P's tragedy was the opposite. He had preserved the abstract but lost the concrete. He functioned like a machine or a computer, capable of analyzing specific features and geometries, but incapable of grasping the living, breathing essence of reality. He suffered from a deficit of judgment in the philosophical sense, the ability to relate the particular to the universal. He could describe the mathematical properties of a glove, but could not perceive its purpose or identity. In Dr. P, we see a man who has lost the world as a landscape of meaning and is left with a world of lifeless abstractions. It serves as a stark reminder that our mental health depends not just on the logical operations of the brain, but on the romantic and personal faculties that allow us to inhabit a coherent, meaningful reality. Chapter 2. To lose a limb is to lose a tool, a function, a part of the body. But to lose memory is to lose the self. Memory is the cohesion of our lives, the glue of our identity, the bridge between our past and our future. Without it, we are nothing but a disconnected moment, a fleeting sensation without a history. This profound horror was articulated by Luis Buñuel, who wrote of his mother's final erasure by amnesia. But for Jimmy G, the horror was not an erasure of the past, but a strange, absolute arrest of time itself. Jimmy was admitted to our home for the aged near New York City in early 1975. He was a handsome, healthy-looking man of 49 with a thick bush of grey hair and a cheerful, friendly manner. He spoke with enthusiasm of his life, his childhood in Connecticut, his school days, and his passion for mathematics and science. He recalled with vivid detail his time in the Navy, having been drafted in 1943 at the age of 17. He spoke of his service on submarines, the names of his shipmates, the missions they undertook. It was a lively, connected narrative, full of the vigor of a young man's life. But then, abruptly, the narrative stopped. He was speaking of the war, of the end of the war, and his plans for the future. He talked of the GI Bill, of going to college. He mentioned his brother, who was in accountancy school and engaged to a girl from Oregon. He spoke in the present tense. A suspicion, chilling and improbable, began to form. "What year is this, Mr. G?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. 45, man. What do you mean? He looked at me with open innocence. We've won the war. FDR's dead. Truman's at the helm. There are great times ahead. And you, Jimmy? How old would you be? He calculated for a moment. Why, I guess I'm 19, Doc. I'll be 20 next birthday. I looked at the grey-haired man before me, impelled by a sudden, perhaps cruel impulse to test the reality of his delusion. I took a mirror from the wall and thrust it in front of him. Look in the mirror and tell me what you see. Is that a 19-year-old looking out? The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. He turned ashen, gripping the sides of his chair. Jesus Christ, he whispered. What's going on? What's happened to me? Is this a nightmare? Am I crazy? Is this a joke? He was seized by panic, a frenzied terror of the unknown image staring back at him. I quickly put the mirror away and distracted him, pointing out the children playing baseball outside the window. The color returned to his face, the terror vanished, and he smiled. I left the room, shaken. When I returned 2 minutes later, Jimmy was still at the window. He turned to me with a bright, welcoming smile. Hiya, Doc. Nice morning. You want to talk to me? Do I take this chair here? There was not a flicker of recognition. He had forgotten me, forgotten the mirror, forgotten his terror. To him, I was a new encounter. We went through the introduction again. He deduced I was a doctor because of my white coat and stethoscope. He looked around the room at the hospital beds and became confused. What is this place anyhow? I see these old people. Am I sick? Do I work here? I tried to probe his memory of the conversation we had just had. You don't remember telling me about your childhood, growing up in Connecticut, working as a radio operator on submarines? Hey, you're right, he said, surprised. But I didn't tell you that. I never met you before in my life. You must have read my chart. The diagnosis was clear, though the severity was staggering. Jimmy suffered from Korsakoff's syndrome, a devastation of memory caused by alcoholic destruction of the mammillary bodies in the brain. For Jimmy, the tape of memory had snapped in 1945. Anything that happened after that date was not recorded. He lived in an isolated, shimmering moment of the now, surrounded by a deep moat of forgetting. He was a man without a past beyond 1945, and without a future, for he could not retain a future long enough for it to become a past. Further testing revealed the extent of his loss. He was highly intelligent, capable of solving complex puzzles and algebraic problems, provided they could be done quickly. If a task took too long, he would forget the question before he reached the answer. He could play checkers and tic-tac-toe with cunning, but chess was too slow. The strategy dissolved in his mind between moves. His memory loss was not just for events, but for the very context of his existence. I showed him a current issue of National Geographic. He identified the planets and elements with the knowledge of a bright high school student of the 1940s. But when I showed him a photograph of the Earth taken from the moon, he was astounded. "Doc, you're kidding. Someone would have had to get a camera up there." His amazement was genuine. He was a pre-Sputnik man encountering the space age. When shown a picture of a modern aircraft carrier, the Nimitz, he became angry. "I know 'em all by name," he said, "and I don't know a Nimitz, unless they named one after the admiral." This cut-off point, 1945, was not merely a matter of memory loss, but a retrograde amnesia that had erased decades of his life. We found that Jimmy had actually remained in the Navy until 1965, functioning competently. It was only after leaving the service that he went to pieces, drinking heavily, leading to his eventual collapse and admission to Bellevue in 1971, delirious and disoriented. The years between 1945 and 1970 were gone, erased as if they had never happened. The tragedy of his condition was most poignant in his relationships. His brother, whom he loved dearly, visited him. Jimmy recognized him instantly, but was baffled and distressed by his appearance. "He's really showing his age," Jimmy would say. "Never noticed it before. How come everyone's showing their age today?" He could not comprehend that the young man he remembered was now a grandfather. These meetings were the only times Jimmy showed true emotion, but they provided no continuity. He lived in a world of isolated impressions, a Humean world where the self was nothing but a bundle of sensations. We tried to help him find some anchor. A diary was suggested, but he would lose it, or if he wrote in it, he would not recognize his own entries the next day. "Eggs for breakfast," he would read, astounded. "I wrote that. I don't remember eating eggs." The diary became a collection of meaningless fragments. Yet, despite this devastation, there were moments when the soul of the man seemed to emerge from the broken mechanism of his brain. I watched him in the chapel, taking communion. He was focused, intense, fully present in the act of worship. In that moment of spiritual concentration, the amnesia seemed to dissolve. He was not a man lost in time, but a man held in the eternal now of the ritual. Similarly, he found peace in gardening. He took over the care of the hospital garden, and there, dealing with the earth and plants, he seemed to find a familiarity that the human world denied him. The garden became his anchor. He never got lost there. It was as if the rhythms of nature, unlike the jagged rhythms of human social life, could still be inscribed upon his being. Jimmy G remained in our home, a man fossilized in the past, unchanging. Neuropsychologically, he was a wreck, a man without a memory. But spiritually, in the quiet moments of gardening or worship, he was fully alive, a testament to the fact that a human being is more than a collection of memory traces. He found his continuity not in time, but in art, in faith, and in the silent communion with the living world. Postscript. It is now known that retrograde amnesia is common in Korsakoff's syndrome. The erasure of the past can be vast, wiping out decades of life. I have seen other patients, like Stephen R., who suffer even more acutely because their amnesia is not as complete or settled as Jimmy's. Stephen, occasionally allowed to visit his home, would recognize his house as it was years ago, but be terrified by changes. New curtains, a different chair. For him, the world was a nightmare of anachronisms, a place where time had gone mad. This phenomenon is not limited to chronic conditions. In transient global amnesia, a temporary loss of memory caused by migraines or vascular issues, a person may lose decades of their life for a few hours, only to regain them as the attack subsides. It is a terrifying reminder of how fragile our hold on the past truly is. There are also cases of modality-specific amnesia. I had a patient who, after a stroke, lost all visual memories. He could not revisit any scene in his mind. he had lost the very concept of seeing. He became a non-visual being, his entire lifetime of visual experience erased in an instant. Jimmy G's case forces us to ask, what is a life without time? If we are defined by our memories, by our narrative, what happens when that narrative is broken? Jimmy showed us that while the narrative self may be damaged, perhaps irreparably, there remains a deeper self, a self capable of feeling, of beauty, of communion, a self that persists even when the past is gone. Chapter 3. Wittgenstein once remarked that the things most important to us are often hidden by their very familiarity. We fail to notice the foundations of our existence because they are always before our eyes. Nowhere is this truer than in the realm of the physical self. We possess a secret sense, a sixth sense identified by Sherrington in the 1890s as proprioception. It is the continuous, unconscious sensory flow from our muscles, tendons, and joints that tells us where we are, that allows us to feel our bodies as our own. Without it, we would not possess ourselves. We would be dispossessed of our own physical being. Christina was a vibrant young woman of 27, a mother of 2, a hockey player, and a self-assured computer programmer. She was a person of robust health and grounded character, as far removed from the hysterical or fanciful as one could imagine. She entered the hospital for a routine gallbladder removal, a simple procedure with no expected complications. She was placed on antibiotics as a precaution, and all seemed well. However, the day before the surgery, Christina had a nightmare of profound intensity. In the dream, she was swaying wildly, unable to find her footing. She looked at her hands and they were flailing, dropping whatever she tried to hold. She could feel nothing. She woke distressed, but the psychiatrist who was called dismissed it as preoperative anxiety, a common enough reaction to the knife. But as the day wore on, the nightmare began to bleed into reality. Christina found herself unsteady, her movements becoming awkward and clumsy. She dropped things. By the day of the surgery, the condition had advanced catastrophically. She could not stand unless she looked fixedly at her feet. Her hands wandered into space unless she kept them in her visual field. Her face went slack, her jaw dropped, and her voice lost its tone. "Something awful's happened," she told the physicians, her voice ghostly and flat. "I can't feel my body. I feel weird, disembodied." The psychiatrist was summoned again, and observing the bizarre symptoms, pronounced it anxiety hysteria. But to the neurological eye, the picture was far more grave. A spinal tap revealed the truth. Christina was suffering from acute sensory neuritis, a rare inflammation affecting the sensory roots of the spinal and cranial nerves. The damage was specific and devastating. It had selectively destroyed the fibers of proprioception. From the top of her head to the tips of her toes, Christina had lost the sense of her own body. She was receiving no information from the periphery. Her brain had no idea where her limbs were, or if she even had limbs, unless she looked at them. The surgery was cancelled, but the damage was done. The inflammation subsided, but the proprioceptive loss was permanent. Christina lay in her hospital bed, a rag doll, unable to sit up, unable to move with any purpose. She faced a terrifying question. How does one live without a body? "I have to watch it," she realized. "I have to be its eyes." Since her body was blind to itself, Christina had to become its external observer. She began the arduous task of relearning every motion of life using vision as a substitute for feeling. If she wanted to reach for a fork, she had to look at her hand, calculate the distance, and visually guide the limb every inch of the way. If her attention wandered for a split second, the hand would drop, the fork would clatter. There was no autopilot, no unconscious adjustment. Over months of agonizing rehabilitation, Christina forged a new way of being. She learned to sit, to walk, to speak. But everything was done by artifice. Her movements, once fluid and natural, became studied and theatrical. She sat in a pose. She spoke with a projected stage-like voice, not because she was acting, but because she had to consciously generate the tone that nature usually provided automatically. She used her eyes and her ears to monitor a self that provided no feedback. She eventually returned home and resumed her work. To the casual observer, she functioned. She could type, she could cook, she could navigate the city. But the internal reality was a landscape of desolation. She had succeeded in operating her body, but she had not succeeded in possessing it. "I feel my body is blind and deaf to itself," she would say. "It has no sense of itself." The tragedy of her condition was compounded by the lack of words to describe it. Blindness and deafness are understood. We have empathy for the loss of the external world. But for the loss of the internal world, for the loss of the body's self, there is no vocabulary and no empathy. When Christina stumbled on a bus, passengers did not offer help. They glared and assumed she was drunk. She was disabled in the profoundest sense, yet her disability was invisible and incomprehensible to others. There were moments of reprieve. A strong wind against her skin or the feel of a convertible car ride could stimulate the superficial touch sensors that remained intact, giving her a fleeting sense of shape and boundary. "It's not the real thing," she said, "but it lifts this horrible dead veil for a while." But mostly, she lived in a void. She felt pythed, like a frog in a biology class whose spinal cord has been scooped out. She was a ghost within her own machine, driving it with fierce will and visual vigilance, but forever separated from the organic joy of being. She was and remains the disembodied lady, a woman who proved that one can lose one's body and yet, through the terrible triumph of the human spirit, survive. Postscript. Christina's condition was unique at the time, but sadly, she now has company. It has been discovered that megadoses of vitamin B6, pyridoxine, often taken by health faddists, can cause a severe sensory neuronopathy identical to Christina's. There are now hundreds of such disembodied individuals. Unlike Christina, whose damage was caused by an unpredictable inflammatory event, these patients can often hope for recovery if the toxic dosage is stopped. But for Christina, the first of her kind, the loss remains absolute, a permanent testament to the vital, silent sense that anchors us in the world. Chapter 4. When I entered the ward, the scene was one of bewildering chaos. A young man, admitted just that day, lay sprawled on the floor by his bed, agitated and flushed. He was a pleasant-looking fellow, no more than 20, who had come in for some routine testing. There had been no indication of madness, no history of delirium, yet here he was, crouched on the linoleum, staring at his own body with a mixture of confusion and horror. I knelt beside him. "What happened?" I asked. "Are you all right?" He looked at me, his eyes wide. "Doc," he said, his voice trembling between laughter and panic. "You won't believe this. It's the weirdest thing. Someone, one of the nurses I bet, played a joke on me, a really sick joke." He went on to explain, with the frantic energy of someone trying to rationalize the impossible. He had woken up feeling fine, perfectly normal. But then he moved his leg and felt something strange in the bed with him. It wasn't just a foreign object, it was a foreign body. "It was a leg," he whispered, shuddering. "A dead, cold, hairy leg, just lying there in the sheets with me." He described the revulsion he felt. It was a ghastly thing, an anatomical specimen that had no business being in a warm hospital bed. He assumed it was a prank, a macabre trick played by the staff or a medical student. He decided to turn the tables. He would grab the thing and hurl it out of the bed, showing them he wasn't afraid. "I got a good grip on it," he said, miming the action. "I grabbed the ankle. It felt disgusting, let me tell you, and I gave it a heave. I threw it right out of the bed." He paused, a look of pure bewilderment crossing his face. "But here's the thing, Doc. When I threw it out, I went with it." The absurdity of the physics baffled him. He had intended to eject the object, but the object was attached to him. The momentum carried him over the edge and he landed in a heap on the floor, still clutching the foreign limb. I looked at the leg in question. It was his left leg. To the eye, it was perfectly normal. But to him, it was an alien entity. I asked him to look at it, to touch it. He did so with visible distaste. "It looks like mine," he admitted. "But it doesn't feel like mine. It feels like paste, like nothing. It's not part of me." "If that is not your leg," I asked gently, "then where is your left leg?" He stopped. The question seemed to short-circuit his agitation. He looked down at his hip, then at the empty space where his proprioception told him his leg should be. He turned pale. "I don't know," he said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "I have no idea. It's gone. It's just nowhere." He was caught in a neurological nightmare, a complete hemineglect combined with a bizarre delusion. His parietal lobe damage had erased the internal map of his left side. The brain, abhorring a vacuum, had not simply registered a lack of a leg, it had categorized the sensationless limb as other. It was a counterfeit leg, a facsimile. He was fighting to throw away a part of himself because his brain no longer recognized the ownership. Postscript. This young man's experience brings us face to face with the concept of ownership of the body. We take for granted that our bodies are our own, that we possess our limbs, but this possession is not a given. It is a construct of the brain. The sense of "this is me," the proprium, relies on a continuous stream of sensory information. When this stream is cut, as it was for this young man, the limb is not just paralyzed, it is disowned. It becomes an object. In some cases, like this one, it becomes a bad object, a persecutor that must be expelled. This is not madness in the psychiatric sense. It is a neurological estrangement. It reveals that our sense of self is not merely a spiritual or psychological state, but a fragile biological reality, dependent on the integrity of the body image stored within the parietal cortex. When the map is erased, the territory is lost. Chapter 5. Madeline J. was 60 years old when she was admitted to St. Benedict's Hospital. She was a woman of high intelligence and spirited character, yet she presented a tragic figure, congenitally blind and afflicted with cerebral palsy. Throughout her life, she had been sheltered and cared for by her family at home, a protected existence that had unforeseen consequences. Despite her physical disabilities, spasticity, and athetosis which caused involuntary movements, her speech was clear, eloquent, and full of life. She was well read, or rather, well listened, having devoured countless books through audio recordings and the reading of others. However, when I asked if she read Braille, she gave a surprising and bitter answer. "I can't do anything with my hands," she said, holding them up with a look of derision. "They are completely useless. They are godforsaken lumps of dough. They don't even feel like part of me." This was a startling statement. While cerebral palsy often affects the hands, rendering them spastic or weak, it rarely destroys their essential utility. I examined her hands and found that their sensory capacities were completely intact. She could instantly identify light touch, pain, temperature, and passive movement. The elementary sensations were there, but the perception was missing. When I placed an object in her hand, she could not identify it. More disturbingly, she made no attempt to explore it. Her hands remained inert, motionless, receiving the object but not looking at it. They were indeed, as she described them, passive lumps of dough. The cause of this profound agnosia, this inability to recognize or use, became clear as I considered her history. Born blind and palsied, she had been swaddled in care. She had been fed, bathed, and dressed by others every day of her life. She had never been required, or perhaps even permitted, to use her hands to explore the world or sustain herself. As an infant, the natural impulse to reach out, to touch, to grasp, had been frustrated or preempted. Consequently, she had never developed the gnostic systems in her brain necessary for manual perception. Her hands were not useless because of her disease. They were useless because they had never been used. She had no manual memory, no reservoir of tactile experience to draw upon. For 60 years, she had lived as a being without hands. The challenge was unprecedented. Could a 60-year-old woman acquire the complex perceptual functions normally developed in the first months of life? There was no clear medical roadmap for such a case. I recalled the work of Leontev and Zaporozhets, who rehabilitated soldiers with hand injuries by forcing them to use their hands in purposeful tasks. But those soldiers were remembering a lost skill. Madeline had to discover one she never had. She had to become a motor individual, to birth a sense of self that included active, exploring hands. We could not simply tell her to use her hands. The neural pathways for such volition did not exist. We had to trick the system to elicit an instinctual drive. I instructed the nurses to place her food just slightly out of reach during mealtimes, not to starve her, but to gently provoke a reaction. The breakthrough, when it came, was absolute. One day, driven by hunger and impatience, Madeline did not wait to be fed. She reached out. Her arm extended, her hand groped, found a bagel, and brought it to her mouth. It was her first manual act in 60 years. In that moment, she was born as a motor being. The consequences were rapid and explosive. Having broken the barrier, her hunger for food transformed into a hunger for the world. She began to reach out to everything, touching, feeling, exploring the shape and texture of her environment. Because she lacked visual imagery, she had to build a world of tactile recognition from scratch. She identified a bagel not by sight, but as round bread with a hole. A fork was an elongated flat object with tines. But soon this intellectual deduction gave way to immediate, intuitive recognition. Objects became familiar friends. She delighted in the physiognomy of things, discovering a world of enchantment and beauty she had only known through words. This sensory awakening sparked a creative urge. She asked for clay. Her first sculpture was of a shoehorn, a simple object, yet she imbued it with a powerful, humorous curve. She progressed rapidly to modeling heads and figures. Her hands, once inert lumps, were now vibrant organs of perception and creation. To be touched by her was a revelation. She did not merely feel, she beheld. Her touch was intense, searching, and synthetic, constructing a whole person from the tactile landscape of a face. Madeleine became the blind sculptress of St. Benedict's, creating works of remarkable expressive energy. In her late years, after a lifetime of darkness and passivity, she had blossomed. She had proved that the latent potentials of the brain, even when dormant for decades, can be awakened by the imperative of use. Postscript. Madeleine's case, while extraordinary, was not unique. I later encountered Simon Kay, a mild-mannered man with cerebral palsy and visual impairment who, like Madeleine, had useless hands due to lifelong disuse. Though he lacked Madeleine's artistic fire, he too was able to acquire manual function late in life, finding great satisfaction in simple carpentry and toy-making. It seems that the capacity for this development is not dependent on high intelligence, but on the fundamental biological principle of use. We see a similar phenomenon in patients with severe diabetic neuropathy who lose all sensation in their hands and feet. They may feel disembodied, as if their limbs end in stumps or lumps of dough. This acquired agnosia can be reversed, often suddenly, by tricking the patient into visually guiding their limbs, re-establishing the neural connection between will and act. The electrical silence of the muscles vanishes, and the limb is re-owned by the self. Whether the deficit is developmental or acquired, the lesson remains. The body is not a fixed machine, but a dynamic process, sustained and defined by its active engagement with the world. A phantom is a persistent ghost of a lost limb, a vivid presence where there is now only absence. It is a universal experience for those who have lost a part of themselves, a neurological refusal to accept the void. But there is a flip side to this phenomenon, a phantom not of presence, but of absence. It is the negative phantom, the experience of a limb that is physically present, but experientially gone. Phantom finger. A sailor, a man of 40, came to see me. He had lost his right index finger in an accident at sea. For 40 years he had lived with a phantom finger, a sensation so real he could feel it twitch and curl. But recently he had developed a severe diabetic neuropathy, losing sensation in his hand. As the feeling in his real fingers faded, the phantom finger, paradoxically, became the only part of his hand he could still feel. "It's like this, Doc," he said, holding up his hand. "My real fingers are dead to me. I can't feel a thing. But this ghost finger, it's alive. I feel it burning. I feel it cramping. I'd give anything to swap." The phantom had become more real than the reality. He was a man haunted by a memory while his living flesh turned into a ghost. Disappearing, phantom limbs. We often assume phantoms are permanent, but they can fade. A patient who loses a limb may find the phantom shortening over time, telescoping into the stump until only the hand or foot remains attached to the torso. But sometimes the phantom simply vanishes. One patient, an amputee of 20 years, woke up one morning to find his phantom leg gone. "It's the damnedest thing," he said. "I used to know where my foot was. Now I have to look to make sure I haven't left it behind." The loss of the phantom was, in a strange way, a second amputation. He had lost the internal representation of his leg, the neural map that had survived the physical loss. He was now doubly an amputee, once in the body and once in the brain. Positional phantoms. We think of phantoms as fixed, but they can be dynamic. A veteran of the Great War described how his phantom hand would sometimes get stuck in awkward positions. "If I'm not careful," he said, "I'll try to walk through a door and my phantom arm will catch on the frame. It's like dragging an invisible anchor." These positional phantoms are not mere hallucinations. They are persistent neural firings in the sensory cortex, maintaining the last known position of the limb before it was severed. The brain, lacking new input, simply holds the last note of the song forever. Phantoms, dead or alive. There is a vital distinction to be made between a live phantom and a dead one. A live phantom is part of the self. It can move, it can feel, it can be used in dreams. A dead phantom is a statue, a fossilized memory of a limb that no longer participates in life. I recall a patient, a pianist, who lost his right arm. For years he felt his phantom fingers playing the keys. "I can still practice," he told me. I can rehearse the fingering in my mind, and my phantom does it. This was a live phantom, a tool of the artist's will. Contrast this with a man who lost his leg in a car crash. His phantom was a heavy, painful, paralyzed weight. "It's a dead thing," he said. "It's just a slab of meat that isn't there." His phantom was a source of torment, a neurological corpse he was forced to drag through life. Postscript. The study of phantoms is a journey into the neurology of the self. It shows us that the body we live in is not just a physical object, but a construction of the brain. We build our bodies from the inside out, projecting a body image that may or may not align with physical reality. When the physical body is broken, the brain's image may persist, creating a phantom. But this phantom is not just a memory, it is a dynamic, living construct. It can be modified, it can be cured, as in the case of painful phantoms treated with mirrors or stimulation, or it can fade away. The most profound lesson of phantoms is that we are not merely our bodies, we are the idea of our bodies. And sometimes the idea is stronger than the flesh. Chapter 7. In the realm of neurological disorders, few conditions are as bizarre and yet as illuminating as those affecting the vestibular system, the delicate apparatus within the inner ear that governs our sense of balance, orientation, and verticality. We take for granted our ability to stand upright, to know which way is up, assuming it to be a fixed constant of the universe. But for Mr. McGregor, a vibrant and intelligent man of 93, up had become a matter of opinion, and a tilted one at that. Mr. McGregor walked into the clinic with a distinctive, albeit precarious, gait. He leaned significantly to the left, his body listing like the Tower of Pisa. Yet he seemed oblivious to his own tilt. When I asked him about it, he was puzzled. "I'm not leaning," he insisted, his voice firm. "I'm standing perfectly straight." To prove his point, he stiffened his posture, but the list to the left remained unchanged. He was, in his own internal perception, vertical. The world around him, however, disagreed. "Look in the mirror," I suggested, guiding him towards a full-length glass. He shuffled over, still leaning, and gazed at his reflection. His eyes widened in genuine shock. "Good God!" he exclaimed. "I'm tipped over. I look like I'm about to fall." The mirror provided him with visual evidence that contradicted his internal sense. He could see he was leaning, but he could not feel it. As soon as he closed his eyes or stepped away from the mirror, his body drifted back to its comfortable, erroneous, vertical. This phenomenon, known as Parkinsonian Pisa syndrome, is a result of a dysfunction in the integration of vestibular, proprioceptive, and visual information. Mr. McGregor's brain was receiving faulty signals from his balance sensors, telling him that upright was actually a 20-degree list to the left. When he tried to stand physically straight, his brain screamed that he was tilting right, and he would instinctively correct himself back to the left. The problem was not merely cosmetic, it affected his mobility and safety. But how does one correct a sense of self that is fundamentally miscalibrated? We could not surgically realign his vestibular system. We had to find a way to bypass it, to provide him with an artificial sense of verticality that he could trust over his own flawed feelings. The solution came from an unlikely source, the spirit of invention that Mr. McGregor himself possessed. He had been a carpenter in his youth, a man who understood levels and plumb lines. "If I can't trust my own feelings," he mused, "I need a tool. I need a spirit level for my head." We set to work. We fashioned a pair of spectacles with a special attachment. From the frame, we suspended a small horizontal tube containing a bubble in colored fluid, a miniature spirit level. The device was positioned so that it sat just on the periphery of his vision. Mr. McGregor put them on. He stood up, leaning as usual. "Look at the bubble," I instructed. He glanced up. The bubble was way off to the side, indicating a severe tilt. "Now," I said, "move your body until the bubble is in the center." He shifted his weight, straightening his posture. It felt wrong to him. He felt like he was tipping over to the right, but he trusted the bubble. He kept moving until the bubble was centered. "There," he said. "The bubble is dead center." I held up a mirror. He was standing perfectly straight. He laughed with delight. "I'm vertical. I'm on the level." The spectacles became his new sense organ. He wore them constantly. At first it was a conscious effort. He had to check the bubble and adjust. But over weeks, a remarkable thing happened. The brain, ever plastic, began to recalibrate. The visual input from the spirit level started to integrate with his proprioception. He found that he could maintain a vertical posture with less and less conscious checking. He had essentially outwitted his own brain, using a simple carpenter's tool to correct a profound neurological error. Mr. McGregor continued to wear his spirit spectacles with pride. They were not just a medical device. They were a symbol of his ingenuity and his refusal to be defined by a deficit. He had lost his natural level, but he had built a new one, proving that even at 93, the human organism can find new ways to stand tall. Chapter 8. Mrs. S., an intelligent and humorous woman in her 60s, suffered a massive stroke affecting the deeper and posterior portions of her right cerebral hemisphere. She recovered her faculties and her wit, but the stroke left her with a singular and profound deficit. She has effectively lost the left. This is not merely a blindness to the left side of the world. It is something far more radical. Mrs. S. has lost the very idea of left. For her, the world, her body, and space itself end at the midline. Beyond that, there is nothing. Not darkness, not a void, but simply a cessation of existence. The consequences of this hemi-inattention are observed most starkly at mealtimes. Mrs. S. sits at her table, chatting animatedly, and proceeds to eat. She clears the right side of her plate with gusto, savoring every bite. But when the right half is empty, she stops. She puts down her fork, satisfied or perhaps complaining that the portions are too small. She remains completely oblivious to the fact that the left half of her plate is still heaped with food. "I've finished," she announces, while a pile of mashed potatoes and roast beef sits untouched just inches away. The nurses, understanding her condition, do not argue. They simply rotate the plate 180 degrees. Suddenly the lost food enters her right visual field. "Oh!" she exclaims, delighted and surprised. "I didn't realize there was more. How lovely." She then proceeds to eat this new food, which has now entered the realm of the existing. This neglect extends to her own person. Mrs. S. takes great pride in her appearance. She applies her makeup with care, lipstick, rouge, eyeshadow. But when she turns to face you, the effect is startling. The right side of her face is perfectly groomed, a portrait of elegance. The left side is completely bare, devoid of any cosmetic touch. She cannot feel the difference, nor can she see it in the mirror, for when she looks in the mirror, she sees only the right side of her reflection. The left side of the mirror, like the left side of the world, does not exist. We tried to help her understand intellectually what she could not perceive experientially. She knows, in theory, that she has a left neglect. She understands that there is a left side to the world that she is missing. But she cannot turn her head to find it. To turn left is an impossible command. The very concept of turning left has no neural address in her brain. However, Mrs. S. is a woman of resourcefulness. She has devised a strategy to trick her own brain. If she suspects she is missing something, like the rest of her lunch, she does not try to look left. Instead, she rotates her wheelchair in a full circle to the right. She spins clockwise, 270 degrees, 300 degrees, until the missing left side comes into view from the right. "There it is," she will say triumphantly, having found the left by chasing it from the right. We attempted a more high-tech solution. We set up a video camera and a monitor. The camera was pointed at her left side, and the monitor was placed on her right. The idea was that she could look at the screen on her right and see her left side. We hoped this would allow her to apply her makeup correctly. The experiment was a fascinating failure. Mrs. S. looked at the screen and saw the left side of her face, but the image was baffling to her. She saw a face. She recognized it as her own, but the spatial translation was impossible. When she tried to reach for her left cheek based on the image on the right, her hand went into a chaotic spasm of confusion. "It's no good," she said, frustrated. "The screen tells me it's there, but my hand tells me it's nowhere. I can't reconcile them." The video feedback, rather than bridging the gap, only highlighted the profound disconnect between her visual logic and her spatial sense. The left side of her body remained an alien territory, visible only through a technological proxy that she could not integrate into her bodily schema. So, Mrs. S. continues her life in a hemi-world. She navigates her wheelchair in right-handed circles. She eats her half-meals until they are rotated, and she greets the world with a half-painted face. She is a woman who lives entirely on the right, a voyager who has fallen off the edge of the left side of the map. Postscript: Mrs. S.'s case is a classic example of hemi-inattention or neglect, a condition almost exclusively associated with damage to the right hemisphere. It is distinct from blindness. A blind man knows he cannot see. He has a concept of the visual world he has lost. Mrs. S has no concept of what is missing. The left is not a darkened room, it is a room that has ceased to be part of the house. This neglect can manifest in strange ways. I have seen patients who, when asked to draw a clock, will crowd all the numbers, 1 through 12, onto the right side of the circle, leaving the left side blank. They know a clock has 12 numbers, but they have no space on the left to put them, so they squeeze them all into the only space that exists. Even more uncanny is the phenomenon of bisected hallucinations. A patient with right hemisphere seizures may hallucinate a person standing next to them, but they will see only the right half of the hallucination. The phantom visitor is sliced down the middle, a neurological ghost obeying the same laws of neglect as the physical world. It seems that even our dreams and delusions must respect the boundaries of our damaged brains. Chapter 9. The ward was filled with a strange, spontaneous eruption of laughter. It was not the laughter of a joke shared, but the roaring, unrestrained mirth of people watching a farce. The occasion, however, was serious. The President of the United States was delivering a televised address. To the rest of the country, it was a moment of solemn political rhetoric. To the patients in the aphasia ward, it was a comedy of the absurd. These men and women, victims of severe brain damage, had lost the power to understand words. They suffered from global receptive aphasia. To them, the president's speech was devoid of semantic meaning. It was a stream of unintelligible noise. Yet, they were laughing. Why? Because while they had lost the understanding of language, they had not lost the understanding of communication. Indeed, their sensitivity to the non-verbal, to the tone, the rhythm, the cadence, the facial expressions, and the gestures had been paradoxically heightened. Language is not merely a code of words, it is a physical act. It is accompanied by a rich utterance of emotional cues, the subtle shifts in pitch, the widening of an eye, the tremor of a hand. These cues are deeply embedded in our biology, far older than speech itself. While the aphasic patient may be deaf to the dictionary definition of a word, they are exquisitely attuned to the emotional truth of the speaker. They can detect a lie, a hesitation, a false note in the voice with the precision of a lie detector, and this was the source of their mirth. They were watching a performance. They saw the president's carefully rehearsed gestures, his calculated pauses, his modulated intonations. To a normal listener, these theatrical devices reinforce the message. To the aphasic, stripped of the message, they were laid bare as grotesque mannerisms. They saw the artifice, the acting, and it appeared to them as a clumsy, transparent charade. The grimaces, the brow furrowing, the stilted hand movements, all intended to convey sincerity, were perceived by the patients as the signals of a man trying too hard to be sincere. They were not listening to a leader, they were watching a bad actor, and they laughed because the deception was so obvious to them. In this sense, the aphasiac is the ultimate realist. He cannot be seduced by words, he cannot be manipulated by the complex linguistic structures that hide the truth. He is forced to rely on the most primitive and honest channel of communication, the body and the voice's music. If a man speaks falsely, his body will betray him, and the aphasiac will see it. Thus, the president, who could fool a nation of normals with his rhetoric, could not fool a room of brain-damaged patients. They saw him not as a statesman, but as a deceiver whose mask had slipped. But there was one patient in the room who was not laughing. Emily D. sat stony-faced, concentrating intensely on the television. Her condition was the mirror image of the others. She had a form of tonal agnosia. She could hear the words perfectly. Her grammatical and semantic processing was intact, but she was completely deaf to the emotional quality of the voice. To her, a scream and a whisper were identical in tone. An angry shout and a loving coo were distinguished only by their volume, not their feeling. She lived in a world of pure text, stripped of its music. Because she could not hear the emotional cues that sway the average listener, Emily D. had to rely entirely on the logic and structure of the words themselves. She had become a master analyst of syntax and prose. She listened not to the how, but to the what. "He is not speaking good prose," she declared, her voice flat and analytical. "His word use is improper. Either he is brain-damaged or he is concealing something." While the aphasics detected the lie through the falsity of the tone, Emily detected it through the falsity of the language. She noticed the evasive passive voice, the broken logic, the concealed subjects. She heard the speech not as an emotional appeal but as a constructed text, and she found the construction wanting. The evocative language that moved the crowd was, to her precise ear, merely word salad designed to obfuscate. Here, then, was the paradox of the president's speech. The normal audience, distracted by the perfect blend of words and tone, was successfully persuaded or deceived. But the patients in the ward, each stripped of one half of the perceptual equation, saw the truth. The aphasics, deaf to the words, saw the physical lie. Emily D., deaf to the tone, heard the linguistic lie. It leads to a disturbing conclusion: that we, the healthy, are perhaps the most vulnerable to deception. We are seduced by the combination of style and substance, allowing one to cover the flaws of the other. It is only the brain-damaged, the pathological observers, who, by virtue of their deficits, are forced to see the world with a clarity that the rest of us have lost. They are the unfoolable. Part 2. Introduction. The history of neurology, and indeed of medicine itself, has been largely written in the language of loss. We speak of deficits, of impairments, of functions that have been subtracted from the human repertoire. We have a vast library of terms to describe what is missing: aphasia, apraxia, paralysis, amnesia. But what of the opposite? What of the disorders not of poverty, but of abundance? There is a strange silence in our medical lexicon regarding the positive disorders, conditions characterized not by a lack, but by an excess. We have no convenient terminology for a superabundance of function. We struggle to describe a mind that is not broken but rather overcharged, a nervous system that is not failing but firing with too much intensity, too much speed, too much life. This oversight is not merely linguistic, it is conceptual. Classical neurology, rooted in the mechanistic view of the 19th century, saw the brain as a hierarchy of controls. Illness was viewed as a release of lower primitive functions due to the failure of higher inhibitory ones. In this view, a tremor or a tic is merely a defect of control, a negative phenomenon. But to the patient and to the observant physician, these releases feel like something quite different. They feel like positive forces, surges of energy, explosions of will, irrepressible drives. We must, therefore, turn our attention to the realm of excesses. Here we do not find the tragic stillness of the deficit, but the manic, dynamic, and often creative chaos of the superabundant. Consider Tourette's syndrome, a condition that will feature prominently in these pages. It is characterized by an excess of nervous energy, an excess of motion, of impulse, of association. The Tourettic individual is not lacking in the traditional sense, rather they are possessed by a surfeit of being. They are driven by a biological imperative to move, to shout, to mimic, to touch. Their world is not one of silence, but of a riotous, uncontrollable liveliness. This excess forces us to reconsider the nature of health and illness. Can one be too well? Can a sense of well-being be pathological? In the case of Cupid's disease, we will see precisely this. A woman who feels arguably better than she has in decades, precisely because of a neurological infection. We will encounter patients whose illness grants them new powers, powers of speed, of mimicry, of memory, even as it disrupts their lives. These disorders of excess are not merely medical curiosities, they are existential states. They force the organism to adapt, often in spectacular ways. The patient must learn to ride the whirlwind of their own nervous system. It is a dangerous, exhilarating, and exhausting mode of existence. In exploring these tales, we leave the quiet, shadowed valleys of loss and ascend into the bright, jagged peaks of excess. It is a realm of high energy, of quicksilver thought, and of strange, frantic adaptations. Here, the struggle is not to regain what is lost, but to tame what is unleashed. Chapter 10. In 1885, Gilles de la Tourette described a syndrome of convulsive tic that was as spectacular as it was debilitating. For a brief moment, it was understood as a neurological disorder, a storm in the motor centers of the brain. But as the 20th century dawned, the physical explanation was eclipsed by the psychoanalytic. The tics, the curses, the strange compulsions were reinterpreted as moral failings or repressed aggression. For 50 years, the Tourette was treated not as a patient with a chemical imbalance, but as a person with a character flaw. It was only recently, with the discovery of dopamine and its antagonists, that the condition was returned to its rightful place in neurology. We learned that the Tourette is not acting out a repression, but is driven by a physiological excess, a superabundance of the neurotransmitter dopamine in the primitive parts of the brain. Ray was 24 years old when he sought help. He was incapacitated by his condition, unable to hold a steady job or maintain a relationship. His life was a barrage of involuntary movements, yelps, and sudden, shocking outbursts of profanity. In the quiet of an office or the intimacy of a conversation, he would suddenly be seized by a tic that shattered the moment. However, Ray was not merely a victim of random spasms. His tics were possessed of a strange, frenetic brilliance. He was incredibly fast, both physically and mentally. He was a jazz drummer of considerable talent, and his drumming was fueled by the very chaotic energy that plagued his daily life. When he drummed, the tics were transformed into syncopated rhythms. The pathology became art. I witnessed this speed firsthand during a game of ping-pong. Ray was unbeatable. He did not play with strategy, he played with reflex. He returned shots almost before they were hit, his body reacting with a velocity that seemed to bypass conscious thought. He was like a man possessed by a lightning-fast demon, a creature of pure, uninhibited reaction. Yet the social cost was too high. Ray wanted normalcy. We decided to try Haldol, a powerful drug that blocks dopamine receptors. It acts, in essence, as a chemical damper on the brain's engine. The results were catastrophic. Ray returned a week later with a black eye and a broken nose. "I can't move," he said. "I can't react." The drug had worked too well. It had stripped him not only of his tics, but of his speed, his wit, and his musicality. In the ping-pong game of life, he was now missing every ball. He described himself as feeling sober, solid, and dead. He had become a prosaic citizen, capable of functioning in a bank, but he had lost the poetry of his existence. He was no longer witty, ticsy Ray, he was just Ray, the slow, deliberate, slightly depressed man. We were faced with a profound philosophical dilemma. Medicine assumes that health is always superior to illness. But what if the illness confers gifts? What if the excess of Tourette's provides a vitality, a creative spark, that normal health cannot match? Ray found the normal world to be slow, grey, and dull compared to the incandescent high-speed world of his disorder. Ray and I reached a compromise, a unique arrangement that acknowledged the duality of his nature. He would not be wholly sick, nor wholly well. He would live two lives. From Monday to Friday, Ray takes his Haldol. He becomes the solid citizen, the reliable employee, the man who speaks in measured tones and walks with a steady gait. He endures the sobriety of the drug to function in the structured world of society. But on the weekends, he stops. He throws away the pills and lets the dopamine flood back. He becomes witty, ticky Ray once more. He drums with frantic energy, he plays ping-pong with supernatural speed, he jokes, he ticks, he flies. He spends his weekends in the high of his own chemistry, reconnecting with the wild, creative self that the medication suppresses. Ray's solution reminds us that human identity is not a monolith. He oscillates between two states of being, one chemically constructed, one neurologically innate, and finds value in both. He has learned to manage his own excess, navigating the strange borderland between the burden of a disease and the gift of a unique, energetic soul. Chapter 11. Natasha Kay was a woman of 88, yet she walked into the clinic with the spring and vibrancy of a woman half her age. Her eyes sparkled, her gestures were animated, and her voice carried a lilt of excitement that was utterly incongruous with her years. She had come to see me not because she was suffering, but because she was, in her own estimation, feeling entirely too well. "I haven't felt this alive in 20 years, she declared. "I am bursting with energy. I feel frisky. I have taken a sudden interest in young men. It is delightful, doctor, but let us be honest, it is not normal. I am nearly 90. This is not health, this is something else." She was right. The sudden onset of euphoria, disinhibition, and a surge in libido in a person of her advanced age suggested a neurological shift rather than a spiritual rejuvenation. As she spoke, she began to piece together the puzzle herself. She looked at me with a knowing, almost mischievous smile and tapped her temple. "I think I know what it is," she whispered. "I think it is Cupid's disease." She recounted a fragment of her history from 70 years prior. As a young woman, she had lived in Salonika, a life she described as wild and full of adventure. It was there, she believed, that she had contracted syphilis. She had been treated, of course, with the methods available at the time, and had assumed the infection was long gone. But she knew that the spirochetes of syphilis could sleep for decades, hiding in the dark recesses of the body, only to awaken and ascend to the brain in the winter of life. Tests confirmed her intuition. The spinal fluid was positive. The ancient infection had indeed reactivated. It was neurosyphilis, specifically Tabes dorsalis, stimulating the cerebral cortex. The bacteria were irritating her brain, acting as a biological stimulant, flooding her system with dopamine or some other excitatory agent that mimicked the chemistry of youth. We were faced with a unique ethical and medical dilemma. The standard procedure was clear: administer massive doses of penicillin to kill the spirochetes and halt the progression of the disease. But Natasha hesitated. "I know I must treat it," she said, her face clouding for the first time. "I don't want it to get worse. I don't want to lose my mind or my control, but doctor, I must tell you, I like this. I like feeling young. I like the energy. I lived in a grey world for 20 years, a world of widowhood and old age. Now suddenly the colours have returned. Must I give that up? Must I go back to being a tired old woman?" She was asking if the cure would strip her of her newfound vitality. Would killing the infection also kill the joy it had brought? It was a question that struck at the heart of what we consider illness. Here was a disease that, in its early stages, felt like a gift. We formulated a plan that relied on the specific nature of the damage. We hoped that the penicillin would kill the active infection, the spirochetes themselves, preventing any further destruction of her brain tissue. However, the changes that had already occurred, the disinhibitions, the slight cerebral irritation that caused her euphoria, might be permanent. In essence, we hoped to kill the invader but leave the high intact. It was a gamble, but it paid off. The penicillin did its work, the infection was eradicated, but the spark remained. Natasha K. did not descend back into the grey lethargy of her 80s. She remained lively, witty, and undeniably frisky, but the threat of degeneration was gone. She had managed to negotiate a truce with her disease, keeping the cupid while banishing the sickness. She lived out her remaining years as a woman who had found a strange, pathological, yet welcome fountain of youth. Postscript. The case of Natasha K. brings to light the strange duality of neurosyphilis, the great imitator. Historically, before the advent of penicillin, syphilis was a master of disguise, capable of mimicking almost any neurological or psychiatric condition. But in its tertiary phase, affecting the brain, general paresis of the insane, it often began not with madness, but with a seductive enhancement of the self. There are recorded cases of artists, writers, and composers who, in the early grip of the disease, experienced surges of manic creativity and inspiration. The irritation of the frontal lobes produced a state of transcendent energy, a divine madness that fueled their work before the inevitable collapse into dementia. In Natasha's case, we see a benign echo of this phenomenon, a biological accident that provided a lonely old woman with a final, vibrant act of life. It challenges our rigid definitions of health, suggesting that sometimes a little pathology can be a revitalizing force. Chapter 12. A man walks into a clinic. He is affable, articulate, and utterly devoid of a personal history. He knows his name, William, but beyond that he is a ghost in his own life. He cannot tell you where he is, how he got there, or what he did 5 minutes ago. His memory span is measured in seconds. Yet, unlike the tragic stillness of Jimmy G, William is a whirlwind of activity. He does not sit in silence. He talks. He talks incessantly, constructing a new identity for himself and for you with every breath. William suffers from Korsakoff's syndrome, but his manifestation is markedly different. His memory loss has created a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. To fill the void of his missing past, William confabulates. He invents. He does not lie in the conventional sense, for a lie requires a truth to conceal. William has no truth. He has only the desperate need to make sense of the moment, to build a bridge across the abyss of his amnesia. As I approached him, he greeted me with the warmth of an old friend. "Hiya, Doc," he exclaimed, pumping my hand. "Good to see you again. How's the fishing trip coming along? Did you catch that big one?" I had never met him before, and I do not fish. But to William, in that instant, I was a fishing buddy. A moment later, his eyes darted to my white coat. The fishing buddy hypothesis collapsed, and a new one was instantly erected. "Ah, of course," he said, shifting his tone to one of professional camaraderie. "You're the new consultant from the Butchers' Union. I was just telling the boys in the back that we need to talk about the new cuts. Prime rib is going up, you know." He was now a butcher, and I was his colleague. This shape-shifting continued at a dizzying pace. In the span of 10 minutes, William was a grocer, a clergyman, a mechanic, and a doctor. He was never lost for a role, never silent, never still. He was manic, driven by a frenetic energy to world make. For him, the world was not a stable place of fixed identities. It was a stage where the scenery and the characters were constantly dissolving and being rebuilt. It was exhausting to watch, and even more exhausting to engage with. To talk to William was to step into a kaleidoscope. You had to be willing to be anyone he needed you to be. A customer, a patient, a priest, and just as you settled into the role, the kaleidoscope would turn, and you would be someone else. Beneath this frantic invention lay a profound and terrifying anxiety. William was a man running across a frozen lake that was cracking beneath his feet. He could not stop, for to stop would be to fall into the black water of nothingness. His confabulations were his way of staying afloat, of maintaining a continuous narrative in a life that had been shattered into discrete, unconnected moments. "I am who I pretend to be," Kurt Vonnegut wrote. For William, this was literally true. He had no underlying I anymore. He was only the sum of his momentary pretenses. He was a matter of identity in the most literal sense, a man whose identity was not a solid rock but a flowing river of improvisations. One afternoon, I found him in a rare moment of stillness. He was sitting by the window looking out at the street. The manic stream of talk had dried up. His face was slack, his eyes empty. "William?" I asked gently. He turned slowly. There was no recognition, no spark of invention. He looked through me as if I were made of glass. I don't know," he whispered. "I don't know who I am." It was a glimpse into the abyss. For a fleeting second, the frantic mechanism of confabulation had failed, and he was left with the raw, terrifying truth of his condition. He was a man without a self, a soul adrift in a universe without landmarks. Then, as quickly as it had vanished, the mask returned. He blinked, saw a nurse walking by with a tray, and his face lit up. "Hey, waitress!" he called out. "I ordered that ham on rye 20 minutes ago. What kind of deli is this?" The butcher-grocer clergyman was back. The void had been covered over once more. William had successfully reinvented himself, and the terrifying silence was drowned out by the noise of his own creation. Chapter 13. Mrs. B was a woman of 62, a former research chemist who had suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage. She had been a woman of high intelligence, sharp wit, and strong personality. But the person who now sat before me was radically transformed. She was, in a word, de-souled. Her intelligence remained largely intact. She could solve complex puzzles, perform calculations, and answer factual questions with speed and accuracy. But her personality, her self, had evaporated. She was completely indifferent to everything. Nothing mattered to her, not her family, not her condition, not her future. "Mrs. B," I asked, "how do you feel?" "I feel nothing," she replied, her voice flat and monotone. "I feel empty." This emptiness was not depression. A depressed person feels a profound sadness, a weight of despair. Mrs. B felt nothing at all. She was in a state of equalization, where every event, every thought, every emotion held the same zero value. If told her house was burning down, she would likely nod and ask for a glass of water. If told she had won the lottery, she would display the same indifference. One day, I found her in a strange state. She was sitting in her chair, staring blankly ahead. "Mrs. B," I said, "are you there?" "Yes," she answered, without turning her head. "Who are you?" "I am the Queen of England," she stated flatly. "Really? And who am I?" "You are the Pope. And the nurse?" "She is the Virgin Mary." This was not a delusion in the psychotic sense. She did not believe she was the Queen. She was simply equating identities. In her world, where nothing had meaning, everything was interchangeable. Queen, Pope, nurse, doctor, these were just words, labels floating in a meaningless void. Since nothing had value, everything had equal value. She could be anyone, because she was no one. This jocularity, or Witzelsucht, as the Germans call it, is a hallmark of frontal lobe damage. It is a superficial, empty wit, a play on words without depth or feeling. Mrs. B would make puns, crack jokes, and engage in silly wordplay, but her eyes remained dead. There was no mirth in her laughter, only a mechanical reflex. One afternoon I tried to provoke a reaction. I told her a tragic story about a patient who had died. "That's very sad," she said, her face impassive. "Pass the salt." The tragedy had registered as a fact, but it had failed to trigger any emotional resonance. She was cut off from the limbic system, the seat of emotion. She was a mental computer processing data without feeling. However, there was one exception. Mrs. B had a deep love for her grandchildren. When they visited, a flicker of the old Mrs. B would return. She would smile, a genuine smile, and ask about their school. For a brief moment, the equalization would break, and value would return to her world. But as soon as they left, the grey curtain would fall, and she would return to her state of indifferent désoulement. Her case forces us to confront the terrifying fragility of the self. We assume that our soul, our personality, is immutable, but Mrs. B shows us that it is dependent on the integrity of the frontal lobes. Damage this area, and the I dissolves into a meaningless stream of data. The yes, father, sister of the title refers to this indiscriminate affirmation, where a priest is a sister, a doctor is a pope, and everything is nothing. Postscript. Mrs. B's condition is often called frontal lobe syndrome. It is characterized by a lack of inhibition, a lack of foresight, and a profound apathy. But apathy is too mild a word. It is an abulia, a lack of will. The patient becomes a passive object, pushed and pulled by the immediate environment, unable to generate any internal drive. I have seen patients with this syndrome who will sit in a room for hours, doing absolutely nothing, not even thinking. They are awake, but empty. If you put a bowl of food in front of them, they will eat. If you put a puzzle in front of them, they will solve it. But if you leave them alone, they will simply exist, like a stone. This is the ultimate excess of the meaningless. The brain is still active, still processing, but without the filter of value, it processes everything as equal. It is a world without hierarchy, without preference, without love. It is perhaps the most terrifying form of brain damage, for it leaves the machinery of the mind intact while destroying its ghost. Chapter 14. In the outpatient clinic, it is not uncommon to see the odd, the eccentric, or the hyperactive, but the scene that greeted me one Tuesday was of an entirely different magnitude. An old woman, somewhere in her 70s, was moving through the waiting room with a ferocity and speed that defied her age. She was shouting, grimacing, and making sudden, violent gestures. She seemed possessed, not by a demon, but by 1,000 demons, each vying for control of her body and voice. This was the super Tourette, a woman whose condition had escalated to a level rarely seen. Tourette's syndrome, as we have discussed, is characterized by an excess of nervous energy. But here, the excess was so profound it became a caricature of human behavior. She was mimicking everything and everyone around her. If a patient coughed, she coughed 12 times, louder and harsher. If someone crossed their legs, she would cross and uncross hers with the speed of a piston. She was a mirror gone mad, reflecting the world back at itself with a grotesque amplified distortion. She was possessed, she said later, not by evil spirits, but by it, the impulse. "I have no choice," she explained, her voice breathless from the exertion of her own tics. "I see a nose, I must tweak it. I see a bald head, I must slap it. I catch a word, I must repeat it until it loses all meaning. I am at the mercy of the world." The tragedy of her condition was that she had no filter. Most of us have fleeting, irrational impulses, to shout in a library, to make a face at a serious meeting, but we have a governor, a frontal lobe mechanism that inhibits these urges. For the super Tourette, the governor is broken. Every impulse is instantly translated into action. There is no gap between the thought and the deed. Yet, amidst this chaos, there was a strange, frantic brilliance. Her mimicry was cruel but devastatingly accurate. She caught the essential quality of a person in a split second, the pompous tilt of a head, the nervous shuffle of feet, and exaggerated it into a biting satire. She was a caricaturist of the highest order, but her art was involuntary and relentless. One might assume that such a life is a living hell, a constant torment of unwanted motion. And indeed she spoke of the exhaustion, the social isolation, the sheer physical pain of her tics. But she also spoke of something else, a sense of power. "I feel like I have more life in me than 10 people put together," she said, her eyes burning with a manic intensity. I am never bored. I am never still. I am always reacting, always engaged. It is a curse, yes, but it is also a ride. This duality, the curse that is also a gift, is the central theme of the excesses. The super Tourette is a prisoner of her own brain, yet she is also a master of a strange high-speed universe. She lives in a world of hyper-reality, where every sensation is amplified, every gesture is momentous, and silence is impossible. We tried to treat her with Haldol, the standard dopamine blocker. The effect was immediate. The tics stopped. The shouting ceased. She sat in the chair, calm, composed, and utterly miserable. "I feel dead," she wept. "I feel like a zombie. Take it away. Give me back my demons." She preferred the torture of her excess to the emptiness of the cure. For her, to be possessed was to be alive. To be normal was to be nothing. We reduced the dose, finding a precarious balance where she could function without losing her fire. She remains a super Tourette, a woman who lives on the very edge of human capability, a testament to the terrifying, exhilarating power of the uninhibited brain. Postscript. The phenomenon of possession in Tourette's is often misunderstood. It is not a psychological splitting of the self, but a physiological hijacking. The patient feels the tic building up like a sneeze, a premonitory urge, and the relief comes only with the release. But in severe cases, the urge is constant, a rolling boil of neural energy. I have seen patients who catch tics from others. If they see another Tourette, they will instantly adopt their tics, adding them to their own repertoire. It is a form of echopraxia, mimicking movement, that is both compulsive and contagious. One patient described his brain as a sticky surface, where everything he saw or heard got stuck and had to be replayed. This stickiness suggests a breakdown in the brain's ability to ignore the irrelevant. To a normal brain, a cough in a waiting room is background noise. To a Tourette, it is a signal that demands a response. Their world is one of infinite significance, where nothing can be ignored and everything must be answered. Introduction. In the previous section, we explored excesses, the realm of the superabundant, the manic, the energetic. But there is another dimension of neurological experience, one that is perhaps even stranger. It is the realm of transports. The word transport carries a double meaning. In the medical sense, it refers to a seizure, a sudden, overwhelming event that carries the patient away from normal consciousness. But in the poetic sense, it refers to a journey, a rapture, a state of being carried away to another place or time. In these tales, we encounter patients who are transported by their brains into worlds of memory, dream, and hallucination. These are not the fragmented, chaotic hallucinations of the psychotic. They are organized, coherent, and often profoundly meaningful experiences. They are reminiscences, nostalgias, and visions that seem to arise from the deepest strata of the self. They force us to ask, what is the nature of memory? Is the past ever truly gone, or is it preserved in the amber of the brain, waiting for a spark to reignite it? We will meet Mrs. O.C., who heard music so loud and clear she thought her radio was broken, only to find the radio was in her head. We will meet Mrs. B., who was transported back to her childhood in Ireland, reliving scenes with a vividness that made the present fade away. We will encounter the strange, ecstatic seizures of Dostoevsky, who described moments of eternal harmony before the darkness fell. These transports are not merely symptoms, they are revelations. They reveal the brain's capacity to store and replay the entirety of a life. They suggest that we are, in a sense, time travelers, carrying our pasts with us in the intricate circuitry of the temporal lobes. When the circuit is triggered by a seizure, a stroke, or a simple smell, the past becomes the present, and we are transported back to the once upon a time that lives within us all. Chapter 15. Mrs. O.C. was a somewhat deaf but otherwise healthy woman of 88 who lived in an old people's home. One night she dreamt vividly of her childhood in Ireland, of the songs, the jokes, the smells of the turf fire. When she woke, the dream did not fade. The music continued. It was an old Irish song, loud and clear, filling the room. "I thought it was the radio," she told me, "but when I checked, the radio was unplugged. I went to the window thinking it was a neighbor, but the street was silent. Then I realized it was in my head." The music was relentless. It played at a high volume, deafening her to the world. It was not a hallucination in the psychiatric sense. She knew it wasn't real, but perceptually it was indistinguishable from reality. She was hearing a concert that no one else could hear. Investigation revealed a small stroke in her right temporal lobe. The stroke had triggered a musical epilepsy, a seizure of the auditory cortex. But it wasn't just random noise. It was specific, meaningful music from her past. The brain was replaying a record that had been stored in its archives for 70 years. As the weeks passed, the music changed. It moved through a repertoire of songs from her youth. She heard Easter Parade, Danny Boy, and old hymns she had sung in church. Gradually, the volume lowered, and the songs became less intrusive. She began to enjoy them. "It's like being young again," she said with a smile. "I can hear my mother's voice. I can smell the peat. It's a gift." The stroke had opened a door to a lost time. It suggested that our memories are not just abstract data, but full sensory recordings waiting to be played. Mrs. O.C. was not just remembering, she was reliving. She was a time traveler, transported back to the green hills of her childhood by a clot in her brain. Mrs. O.M., another patient, had a similar experience but with a different flavor. She too heard music, loud, deafening Irish jigs. But for her, it was not a gift. It was a curse. "It's maddening," she cried. "I can't think, I can't sleep. It's just noise." The difference lay in the emotional context. Mrs. O.C. had accepted her past. Mrs. O.M. was fighting it. The music forced her to confront memories she had long suppressed. It was an auditory assault, a forced remembrance of things past. These cases of musical hallucinations are rare but revealing. They show us that the brain is a vast library of sound. Every song we have ever heard, every voice we have ever loved, is stored in the temporal lobes. Under normal circumstances, these files are kept closed, but when disease picks the lock, the music pours out, and we are transported back to the soundtrack of our lives. For Mrs. O.C., the music eventually faded as the brain healed, but she missed it. "It's so quiet now," she said wistfully. "I liked the company. I liked being back there." She had been a visitor to her own past, and though the visit was caused by a stroke, it had brought her a strange, unexpected joy. It was a reminder that even in the decay of the brain, there can be a resurrection of the soul. Chapter 16. Mrs. B, a former research chemist of 62, experienced a sudden and dramatic change in her behavior. Within a few days, she became exceptionally jolly, facetious, and prone to endless punning and joking, a state known as Witzelsucht. But more disturbingly, she began to recognize people she had never met. "Hello, George," she would cry out to a stranger in the street. "How's the wife? Haven't seen you since the picnic in 48. She greeted everyone as an old friend. To her, the world was populated entirely by familiar faces. She was déjà vu, personified. Every stranger was a long-lost cousin, a former colleague, or a childhood playmate. This was not a case of simple error. It was a profound misidentification syndrome. Mrs. B was suffering from a carcinoma of the frontal lobes. The tumor was pressing on the limbic system, the seat of familiarity and emotion. It was stimulating a continuous false sense of recognition. We all have a familiarity circuit. When we see a friend, this circuit lights up, giving us that warm glow of recognition. In Mrs. B, the circuit was stuck in the on position. It was firing indiscriminately at everything and everyone. A random face on the bus would trigger the same intense feeling of familiarity as her own daughter. "I know you," she would insist to a bewildered doctor. "You're the man who sold me my first car. Don't deny it." She was drowning in a sea of false familiarity. The boundaries between the known and the unknown had collapsed. For Mrs. B, there were no strangers, only friends she hadn't seen in a while. This incontinent nostalgia was, at first, amusing, but it soon became terrifying. If everyone is familiar, then no one is special. If the past is everywhere, then the present loses its meaning. Mrs. B was trapped in a hallucinated past, unable to distinguish it from the reality of the now. The tragedy was that she knew, intellectually, that she was wrong. "I know I'm doing it," she confessed in a moment of lucidity. "I know I don't know them, but the feeling is so strong I can't resist it. My heart tells me I know them, even when my head says I don't." She was a victim of her own biology, betrayed by a brain that insisted on connecting every dot, even when there were no lines to be drawn. Her world had become a universal family reunion, a relentless, exhausting party of strangers wearing the masks of friends. Chapter 17. Bhagawandi P. was a young woman of 19, a girl of rare beauty and grace who presented with a tragic diagnosis, a malignant tumor, a glioma, growing relentlessly in her left temporal lobe. It was a condition that allowed for no hope of recovery, only a palliative management of her descent. Yet, the manner of her decline was something that defied the grim clinical expectations of decomposition and suffering. It became instead a strange and poignant journey. The temporal lobes are the seat of memory and the sense of personal space and time. As the tumor expanded, encroaching upon these sensitive circuits, Bhagawandi began to experience seizures. But these were not the violent, thrashing convulsions one typically associates with epilepsy. They were dreamy states, identical to those described by Hewlings Jackson a century prior. They were seizures of the mind, moments where the curtain of the present was drawn back to reveal a vivid, hallucinatory past. Bhagawandi had come from India to the West at a young age, but the India of her childhood remained etched in her neural pathways. Now, stimulated by the pathology in her brain, that India began to return. At first, the episodes were fleeting, a snatch of a song, the smell of a specific spice, a flash of a landscape. But as the tumor grew, the visits became longer and more immersive. She would lie in her hospital bed, her eyes open but unseeing of the ward around her. A soft smile would play on her lips. If approached, she might not respond, or she might murmur in her native tongue. To the observer, she was in a stupor. To Bhagawandi, she was home. She described these states with a lucid wonder. She was back in her village. She saw her grandmother moving through the courtyard. She felt the heat of the sun on the rice fields. She smelled the heavy, sweet scent of tropical flowers and the smoke of the evening fires. It was not a memory she was recalling. It was a life she was re-entering. The hallucinations had a full, multisensory depth that reality often lacked. The hospital, with its sterile smells and fluorescent lights, became the dream. The village in India became the solid, vibrant reality. The staff, initially concerned by these lapses in consciousness, soon came to understand their nature. "She is in India," the nurses would say softly, leaving her undisturbed. There was a merciful symmetry to her condition. As the physical body failed, the spiritual or neurological transport intensified. The tumor, in its destruction, was also acting as a creator, stimulating the very centers of nostalgia and belonging. It provided her with a bridge back to her origins. She spent her final days not in a cold institution in a foreign land, but in the warm embrace of her childhood history. In the end, Bhagawandi P. did not just die, she departed. She slipped away during one of these transports, passing from the vision of India into the final silence. It was a death that forced us to reconsider the nature of disease. We typically view pathology as a thief, stealing function and dignity. But here the pathology gave something back. It granted a passage, a final, soothing hallucination that shielded the patient from the terror of mortality and allowed her to close the circle of her life where it began. Chapter 18. The night shift nurse called me with an unusual report. "It's Stephen D," she said, her voice laced with confusion. "He's dreaming, but it's not like any dream I've ever seen. He's sniffing." Stephen D., a medical student of 22, had been a heavy user of cocaine, PCP, and amphetamines. He was a brilliant, tormented young man who had sought escape in chemical alteration. But this particular night, he had taken nothing. He had simply gone to sleep and woken up in a world transformed. When I arrived, Stephen was sitting on his bed, his eyes wide with a feral intensity. He looked at me, then sniffed the air deeply. "I can smell everything," he whispered. "I can smell the fear on you. I can smell the antiseptic from the corridor. I can smell the dust in the corner. It's overwhelming." For 3 weeks, Stephen D. lived in a state of hyperosmia, a heightened sense of smell that rivaled, or perhaps surpassed, that of a bloodhound. His world had shifted from a visual one to an olfactory one. He found he could recognize people by their scent long before he saw them. He could detect emotions, anxiety, lust, anger, by the pheromones they released. He could navigate the hospital by smell alone, creating an olfactory map of the wards. I went into the clinic, he told me later, and I sniffed like a dog. I could tell you who had been there, what they had eaten, if they were sick. It was a whole new universe of information. This dog beneath the skin was not merely a sensory amplification, it was a regression. Stephen felt a primal connection to the world, a direct, unmediated knowledge that bypassed the intellect. He felt alive in a way he never had before. The smells were not just data. They were rich with meaning and emotion. The cause was likely a dopaminergic surge in the limbic system, a chemical accident that unlocked the ancient olfactory pathways usually suppressed in humans. For 22 days, Stephen lived as a nose, experiencing the world as our canine companions do. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The smell world vanished, and he returned to the flat, odorless reality of the human visual spectrum. "I'm glad to be back," he said, "but part of me misses it. It was so concrete, so real. Now everything seems a bit pale." Stephen D. went on to become a successful physician, but he never forgot those 3 weeks. Years later, he would still speak of it with a wistful nostalgia. "I see now," he would say. "I see with my eyes. But I don't know like I did when I was a dog." His case reminds us that our sensory world is a construct, limited by our biology. We see only a fraction of the spectrum. We smell almost nothing. But the potential for a richer, wilder sensory life lies dormant within us, waiting for the right chemical key to unlock the dog beneath the skin. Chapter 19. Donald was a man driven by a singular, terrible act. In a psychotic state induced by PCP, he had murdered his girlfriend. The crime was brutal, but Donald had no memory of it. He had been found wandering the streets covered in blood, with no recollection of the violence he had unleashed. He was institutionalized in a psychiatric facility for the criminally insane. For 4 years, he lived in a strange limbo. He knew he had killed someone. The courts had told him so, the doctors had told him so, but he did not feel it. The memory was completely walled off, a lacuna in his mind. He was a murderer, in fact, but not in consciousness. Then, one day, while out on a cycling trip with the hospital staff, Donald was struck by a car. He suffered a severe head injury, a contusion to the frontal lobes. He was in a coma for 2 weeks. When he awoke, he was different. The wall had come down. "I remember," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I remember everything." The accident had seemingly dislodged the psychological block. The horrific details of the murder came flooding back with the force of a tidal wave. He saw the knife. He heard the screams. He felt the blood on his hands. It was not a memory. It was a re-experiencing. He was trapped in a continuous loop of the killing. "I can't stop it," he sobbed. "It's happening now. It's always happening." Donald was tormented by these reminiscences. They were not just visual. They were multi-sensory. He could smell the fear. He could taste the metallic tang of adrenaline. The frontal lobe damage had seemingly destroyed the inhibitory mechanisms that keep the past in the past. He was suffering from a forced memory, a neurological compulsion to relive the worst moment of his life. The doctors tried everything: therapy, sedatives, antipsychotics. Nothing worked. Donald was drowning in his own history. He became suicidal, unable to bear the weight of his restored conscience. Then a strange thing happened. He began to have seizures. They were temporal lobe seizures, likely a result of the head injury, and with each seizure the memory of the murder would replay in vivid, excruciating detail. It was as if the brain was discharging the traumatic memory in a burst of electrical activity. We put him on anticonvulsants to control the seizures, but a peculiar dilemma arose. If we stopped the seizures, we stopped the venting of the memory, but the pressure of the memory remained, a constant, low-level torture. If we let the seizures happen, he had to endure the horror of the reenactment, but he felt a strange sense of relief afterwards, a cleansing. Donald eventually found a precarious balance. He lived with the ghosts of his past, a man who had been forced by a car accident to confront the monster within himself. His case is a chilling reminder that memory is not always a blessing. Sometimes, forgetting is the only mercy the brain can offer. Chapter 20. The visions of Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century mystic and abbess, are among the most extraordinary documents of religious experience in history. She described, in meticulous detail and with accompanying illuminations, a series of luminous, architectural, and cosmic visions that she claimed were the direct voice of God. For centuries, these were viewed purely through the lens of theology, but a closer neurological examination reveals something else, the distinct, unmistakable signature of the migraine. Hildegard's descriptions are not vague or ethereal, they are precise. She speaks of a great star, most splendid and beautiful, and of many falling stars that turn into black coals. She describes fortified cities and concentric circles of light. These are the classic phosphenes of a visual aura, the fortification spectra, the scintillating scotomas that so often herald a severe migraine attack. But for Hildegard, these were not merely symptoms, they were revelations. The shimmering, wavering light that many migraineurs find sickening was for her the living light, the umbra viventis lucis, a reflection of the divine glory. The feeling of absolute certainty, of profound insight that often accompanies the peak of the aura, the ecstatic aura, was interpreted by her as the descent of the Holy Spirit. This is not to reduce her mysticism to a mere headache, it is to elevate the migraine. For in the crucible of her suffering, Hildegard forged a profound spiritual system. The neurological event was the seed, the interpretation was the fruit of her genius. She did not just have migraines, she inhabited them, and in doing so she transformed a pathology into a prophecy. Her case illustrates the transformative power of the transport. A physiological event originating in the electrical storms of the occipital cortex became the foundation for a theology that has inspired millions. It forces us to ask, where does the biological end and the spiritual begin? In the case of Hildegard, they are one and the same, a divine neurology that opened a window to the cosmos. Introduction. We now enter a realm that is perhaps the most misunderstood and maligned in all of clinical medicine, the world of the simple. The terminology we use is itself a minefield of judgment. Words like retarded, defective, subnormal, and moron are not merely diagnostic labels, they are dismissals. They imply a life that is less than human, a broken version of the norm. Even the kinder terms, like developmentally disabled, define these individuals entirely by what they cannot do. They are defined by a lack, by a failure to reach a statistical standard of intelligence. This judgment stems from a deep-seated bias in our culture and our science. We worship the abstract. We equate intelligence with the ability to conceptualize, to categorize, to solve logical puzzles, and to manipulate symbols. The IQ test, that great arbiter of mental worth, measures precisely this, the capacity for algorithmic thought. If a person cannot perform these mental gymnastics, they are deemed low grade, pushing them to the margins of our concern. But is the abstract the only measure of the mind? Is it the only mode of valid existence? In focusing so obsessively on the deficit of intellect, neurology often misses the fullness of the soul. We fail to see that while the simple may lack the power of generalization, they often possess a profound and superior power of concreteness. They live in a world of immediate, vivid reality, a world of specific images, intense feelings, and rich sensory details that the rest of us, in our rush to categorize, often overlook. A child who cannot grasp the concept of transitive verbs or multiplication may yet understand the nuance of a facial expression, the emotional weight of a melody, or the spiritual gravity of a ritual with an intuition that borders on the miraculous. Their world is not empty or shrunken, as the textbooks might suggest. It is often a world of singular intensity and integrity. The individuals we are about to meet, Rebecca, Jose, the twins, challenge the very hierarchy of human value. They show us that a life without high intellect is not a life without meaning. Indeed, stripped of the ability to rationalize and deceive, the simple mind often retains a purity of feeling and a clarity of perception that we normals, with our complex anxieties and abstractions, have lost. They do not live in a world of shadows, they live in a world of bright, undeniable presence. To understand them, we must lay aside our test scores and our prejudices and learn to speak their language, the language of the concrete, the emotional, and the symbolic. Chapter 21. Rebecca was a 19-year-old girl who carried the clinical label of retarded. Her IQ was measured at less than 60, and by any standard metric of neurological testing, she was a failure. She was clumsy, her movements lacking coordination, she had no sense of left or right, and she struggled with the simplest of abstract tasks. She could not grasp the logic of a basic puzzle or understand the conceptual relationship between objects. To the clinical eye, she was a damaged individual, a collection of deficits. However, when one looked past the test scores, a different Rebecca emerged. She was a girl of profound spiritual and aesthetic depth. While she could not understand a concept, she had a crystalline grasp of a symbol. She loved stories, poetry, and music. When she listened to a poem, her clumsiness vanished. Her posture became graceful, her face expressive, and she seemed to inhabit the narrative with a total, unself-conscious integrity. "I am like a carpet that is unraveled," she once told me, using a metaphor of startling beauty. "I need to be woven back together." She felt her own incoherence, her own brokenness in the face of a world that demanded abstractions she could not provide. Yet, in the theatre or the synagogue, she was whole. The weaving she required was not logical or intellectual, but narrative and ritualistic. She found her identity not in thinking, but in being part of a story or a ceremony. The tragedy of Rebecca's life was the way the medical world treated her. She was placed in a workshop where she was forced to perform mindless, repetitive tasks like sorting buttons, which only highlighted her clumsiness and made her feel more like an idiot. It was an environment designed for a subnormal machine, not a soulful human being. "What am I doing here?" she asked me, her eyes filled with tears. "I want to be in the world of the real. I want to be in the world of the heart." We changed her environment. We stopped the remedial training that focused on her defects and started focusing on her powers. She was moved into drama and dance classes. The transformation was miraculous. In the realm of the symbolic, she was no longer retarded. She was an artist. She possessed a natural dignity and a capacity for deep, empathetic feeling that many normal people lack. Rebecca taught me that we define intelligence far too narrowly. We treat the abstract, schematic mind as the pinnacle of human achievement, while dismissing the concrete, narrative mind as primitive. But for Rebecca, the narrative was her salvation. She lived in a world of images and stories, a world that was coherent, beautiful, and deeply human. She was not a defective person, she was a complete person of a different kind. Chapter 22. Jose was a 21-year-old man who had been cast out by the educational and medical systems as hopelessly retarded. He was a person of few words, often sitting in a state of catatonic-like stillness, his head bowed, his eyes vacant. He had been diagnosed with autism and severe intellectual disability, and for most of his life he was treated as a vegetable, a biological entity that required maintenance but possessed no inner world. However, an unexpected event revealed the hidden landscape of his mind. During a clinical meeting, Jose was given a pen and a piece of paper. On the table sat a magazine with a picture of a walking grove, a lush, complex landscape of trees and winding paths. Jose looked at the picture for a mere few seconds, then began to draw. What emerged was not the clumsy scrawl of a simpleton, but a masterpiece of detail and perspective. With a fluid, unhesitating line, Jose reproduced the entire scene. He captured the intricate interplay of light and shadow, the specific texture of the bark, the delicate lean of the branches. It was a photographic reproduction, yet it possessed something more, an artistic style, a personal vision that transformed the literal image into a living work of art. This revelation shattered the vegetable myth. Jose possessed a visual memory of staggering power. While he could not process the abstract symbols of language or the logic of numbers, he could grasp and retain the entire visual structure of the world with a clarity that few normal artists could achieve. His simple mind was, in fact, a sophisticated recording device, capable of capturing the physiognomy of reality in a single glance. The discovery of Jose's talent changed the way he was perceived and treated. He was no longer a case to be managed, he was an artist to be nurtured. We provided him with better materials, charcoal, paints, large canvases. As he worked, the catatonia vanished. He became focused, animated, and intensely engaged. His drawings became his voice, his way of communicating with a world that had ignored him for 2 decades. Jose's walking grove serves as a powerful metaphor for the hidden potentials within those we label as defective. Beneath the surface of his silence lay a forest of vibrant images and extraordinary capabilities. He was not missing a mind, he possessed a different kind of mind, one that perceived the world not through the thin, grey filter of abstraction, but through the rich, colourful lens of the concrete and the particular. He reminded us that there are many ways to be human, and that a lack of words does not mean a lack of a soul. Chapter 23. John and Michael were twins, 26 years old, who lived in a world defined by numbers. Diagnosed with severe autism and labelled as low-grade mental defectives, they were largely non-verbal and lacked the basic skills for independent living. They were often found sitting together in a corner of the ward, rocking in a rhythmic, synchronized fashion, seemingly cut off from the human world. However, if you sat with them and listened to their quiet, rapid-fire murmuring, you would realize they were not lost in a void. They were inhabiting a vast, crystalline universe of mathematical patterns. Their unique gift first became public knowledge through a simple accident. A box of matches fell from a table and spilled onto the floor. Simultaneously, both twins cried out, 111! I counted the matches. There were exactly 111. When I asked how they knew, they didn't say they had counted them. They simply saw the number. For them, a quantity was not something to be tallied. It was a visual landscape that they perceived instantaneously. To explore the limits of their strange power, I brought a book of prime numbers to our next meeting. I mentioned a 6-digit prime. There was a pause, a moment of deep collective concentration, and then both twins smiled. They began to trade 8-digit primes, then 9-digit primes, tossing them back and forth like two people sharing a wonderful joke. They were not calculating these numbers in the sense that a mathematician or a computer does. They were seeing them. For the twins, prime numbers were not abstract concepts. They were unique, beautiful entities, each with its own distinct face and character. To find a prime was to recognize a friend in a crowd of composite numbers. This numerical communion was their primary way of relating to each other and to the world. It was a secret language, a shared joy in the order and harmony of the mathematical realm. When they were forced into remedial programs designed to teach them simple addition or money handling, they became distressed and uncooperative. The medical world was trying to teach them the alphabet of numbers, unaware that the twins were already reading the poetry of high-level number theory. The tragedy of their story lies in the eventual rehabilitation mandated by the institution. Fearing their obsession was unhealthy, the staff decided to separate them, placing them in different halfway houses and forcing them into menial jobs. The goal was to make them socially functional. The result was the destruction of their inner world. Deprived of each other's company and the time to dwell in their numerical landscapes, their genius withered. They became ordinary, disabled men, compliant, dull, and profoundly lonely. John and Michael showed us that the simple mind can be the seat of extraordinary, specialized powers. Their autism was not just a deficit, it was a different neurological organization that allowed them to perceive the world through the pure, unadulterated lens of number. They reminded us that by forcing normality upon those who are different, we risk extinguishing the very sparks of brilliance that make them unique. They were the calculators of the heart, individuals who found a divine harmony in the midst of their own mental chaos. Chapter 24. Jose was a 21-year-old man who had been cast out by the educational and medical systems as hopelessly retarded. He was a person of few words, often sitting in a state of catatonic-like stillness, his head bowed, his eyes vacant. He had been diagnosed with autism and severe intellectual disability, and for most of his life he was treated as a vegetable, a biological entity that required maintenance but possessed no inner world. However, an unexpected event revealed the hidden landscape of his mind. During a clinical meeting, Jose was given a pen and a piece of paper. On the table sat a magazine with a picture of a walking grove, a lush, complex landscape of trees and winding paths. Jose looked at the picture for a mere few seconds, then began to draw. What emerged was not the clumsy scrawl of a simpleton, but a masterpiece of detail and perspective. With a fluid, unhesitating line, Jose reproduced the entire scene. He captured the intricate interplay of light and shadow, the specific texture of the bark, the delicate lean of the branches. It was a photographic reproduction, yet it possessed something more, an artistic style, a personal vision that transformed the literal image into a living work of art. This revelation shattered the vegetable myth. Jose possessed a visual memory of staggering power. While he could not process the abstract symbols of language or the logic of numbers, He could grasp and retain the entire visual structure of the world with a clarity that few normal artists could achieve. His simple mind was, in fact, a sophisticated recording device, capable of capturing the physiognomy of reality in a single glance. The discovery of José's talent changed the way he was perceived and treated. He was no longer a case to be managed, he was an artist to be nurtured. We provided him with better materials, charcoal, paints, large canvases. As he worked, the catatonia vanished. He became focused, animated, and intensely engaged. His drawings became his voice, his way of communicating with a world that had ignored him for 2 decades. José's walking grove serves as a powerful metaphor for the hidden potentials within those we label as defective. Beneath the surface of his silence lay a forest of vibrant images and extraordinary capabilities. He was not missing a mind. He possessed a different kind of mind, one that perceived the world not through the thin, grey filter of abstraction, but through the rich, colourful lens of the concrete and the particular. He reminded us that there are many ways to be human, and that a lack of words does not mean a lack of a soul.